Welcome back, YouTube. I'm Reedster with Far Gaming, and in this Unity scripting tutorial, we'll be taking a look at variables. We'll touch on different variable types, the differences between public and private, and then finally we'll wrap up by going over the terms declaring, initializing, and scoping your variables. Let's get started. So first off, what are variables? You can think of variables like a box that can store one type of information. So as an example, I have a variable here called player name, and the value of that is set to Gordon. Now, you can also think of this variable as a box that stores the player's name inside of it, storing the name Gordon. And so then throughout my code, whenever I need to pull the player's name for some sort of usage, I can just reference this variable and it will insert whatever the value is into the game, however I'm using it. So again, variables are just boxes that store value in them, and you can update this value as much as you need to. If I have a function in my game to where players can go in and change what their player's name is, then whenever they update that, it will come in here and change the value stored in this box so that the rest of the time throughout the game, that is going to be the value of player name. And if they change it again, it'll update it again, and so on. But to clarify, this name right here of the variable player name won't actually change. It is only the value being stored inside that box that will change. Now, moving on to variable types, I said before that variables can store one type of information, and you have to decide what type works best for each variable that you need. First on our list is integer. In our code, this is referred to as int, and that's how we set the type for this variable right here. And then the value is a whole number. It won't have a decimal, and it can be up to 10 digits long, positive or negative. Now, if you need a number with a decimal in it, that's where you'll probably end up using float. We use the word float to set the type for our variable. This one can have up to about 7 digits in it with a decimal that could be anywhere in the number. And at the end of it, you put an F just to show that it is a float type. Now, this one is super useful here for my player's current health because maybe whenever my player takes damage, it doesn't take away a full point of health. Maybe they only lose half or a third of a point of their health. So I would need a decimal to be able to keep track of that because maybe they go down to 9.5 health left. And with a whole number, if they lost a point of health, depending on the way that it rounds, they would either still be at 10 or they would have dropped to 9, and I wouldn't have that in between that you can get with a float type. Now, if you need a more precise number with a lot more digits, that is where you would use a double type. This one, we use the word double to set the type for our variable. And this one can have up to about 15 or 16 digits in it. Again, the decimal place could be wherever, but because you have so many more digits, you're able to get a larger number, or if you really had to get down to the nitty gritty of like very small decimal places, this one allows you to get further down into those decimals. Also, for a double type, you would set the value with a D at the end. Most of the time, a double is going to be overkill for game development. Unity's API actually only accepts float types. So if you try to feed a double type into Unity's API, it will convert it to a float and you'll lose some of your precision because whatever extra digits you have at the end will be dropped off and rounded up or down. This is also similar to another type for integer where it would be a whole number. They do have a variable type called long. This allows you to get more than the 10 digits that you can get out of int, but depending on your application, most of the time it's going to be unnecessary. Next, we have Boolean. This one shortens to bool whenever you're picking your variable type, and the values for this one are either true or false. After that, we have our string type. You just use the word string to identify the type for your variable. And then for the values, you use double quotes around whatever value you're putting in there. And strings can accept letters, numbers, words, sentences. You could technically do paragraphs, all sorts of different stuff with them. Something important to note with strings, though, is that, such as like whenever you use numbers, they don't hold a numeric value. So if I had this string here with 10 inside of it, the string is not actually the number 10. So if I took this string and added it to another string that had 10 inside of it, it would do what's called concatenation, and it would just take one and put it behind the other. Whereas if you did the same thing with two integers that had the number 10, you would get 20. So with strings, it just takes the raw value inside the string and sticks it beside the other string, which is known as concatenation. After string, we have our character type, which is written as char. The values for that are stored inside single quotes, and it's almost the exact same thing as string, but it is only one individual character. So we can only have the letter G, we could have a lowercase g, we could have individual symbol, different things like that, but it's only a single digit. And lastly, I have this other category down here at the bottom because almost anything in Unity can be turned into a variable. I can have a variable with a type of game object called player. And in there, if I go to my Unity window, I could make that equal to the actual player in my scene. So if I needed to pull information about the player, I could pull that information into my script and use it how I need to. Also, I could make one about this directional light, and if depending on the color of light determines how fast my player is allowed to move, then it would be nice for me to pull this directional light into my script and be able to read what color that light is, and then have a function that sets the speed of my character based on the color of that light. So not only can game objects and components be used as variable types in your scripts, but other scripts can be used as variable types in your scripts. So say I have this new script I've made called leaderboards, and in that script, I need to pull the players' stats to see how they stack up against other players. In here, I can go in and I can create a variable type called player stats that will pull that script as a component, and I'll be able to read any public variables or functions that are in that script. To show you what I mean by public variables and functions, I've added my player stats script to my player in my Unity scene, and currently all we can see is the name of the script. That's because if I go over to the script, all of these are actually set to private right now. If you don't specify in front of them whether they are public or private, they are automatically interpreted as private. So if I come in here and I put public in front of int player max health, as well as the player's current health, I'll put public, and then I save the script. Whenever I go back into Unity and it recompiles, you'll see the player max health and the player current health. They are now available down here. So other scripts and things in my scene can modify these numbers if I need them to. It also makes it nice whenever you're first building your game. If I need to try out a bunch of different numbers for what works best for the health, or even with speed, if I'm not sure how fast I want my character to go and I want to try out a bunch of different ones, I can come in here and set a number, run the game. If I don't like it, I can come right here and just change the number again over and over and over again until I get it fine tuned the way I like. And then if I don't need it to be public anymore, I can go back and make it private. So just to clarify again, public variables are those that can be referenced and accessed from other scripts or objects in your scene, whereas private are variables that can only be accessed from within the script that they are in. So this Boolean is alive equaling true. Only this script can read that and knows that that variable exists and what its value is. So I'm going to wrap up by going over three different terms that I mentioned at the beginning that we haven't exactly labeled what they are yet, and that is declaring, initializing, and scoping. Declaring is simply just creating that variable for the first time in your script. So for integer up here, it's whenever we say public int player max health. We are declaring that variable, and now this script tells Unity to carve out a tiny bit of space in memory for this variable to store some data. That's declaring. Initializing is whenever you actually give that variable some value to hold. So you could do that right here at the very beginning at the same time that you're declaring that variable. Sometimes it may make more sense for you to initialize that variable in the start function if you need some other things to happen first before you can pull a value to store in that variable. That's something I'll go more in depth on a later scripting tutorial. All you need to know for right now is initializing is just giving a value to that variable that you've declared. And lastly, scoping is setting the boundaries of what can access your variable, what sees it. Whenever you put variables at the very beginning of your script like this, the entire script is able to access those, change those, use them, whatever. And especially if you make them public, you're expanding that scope, and other scripts and other objects in your game are able to grab those variables and use them. But if I create a variable down here inside the start function for the first time, if I declare it in here, it is only able to be used in here. It does not exist outside of that function anywhere, because whenever it is created inside of a function, it's kind of like it's being created in its own little bubble. So that's great for a variable that you don't need the entire script to be able to access. Say if you have a function that needs to do some counting or something. Every single time something happens, you need it to add one to this variable. That is a really good example of a time that you would create a variable just in that function, just for that counting, and the entire rest of the script doesn't need to be able to access it and change it. It's just for that function, so you're going to create it inside that function, and it creates a very small scope for that variable. That's it for this Unity scripting tutorial. If you learned something, please consider subscribing to my channel to see more Unity tutorials, and I'll see you on the next one.